Today won't be the movie reading. Inshallah, we'll get a good flow as per usual, but it won't have all the battle scenes and descriptions as last time because at this point, the feet of the Muslims, they're licking their wounds, they're you know rekindling their forces and going from there, inshallah. But which again, one of the major events of the Battle of Uhud eventually leads. It's so much dramatic focus is put on that because it is one of the more exciting parts. The aspect of battle and the turmoil behind it, and what led up to that, and then the aftermath sometimes isn't always looked upon. But that's where we're going to be at for this one. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Verily, our praise is due to Allah. We praise Him. We seek His aid and we ask for His forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah from the evils of our own selves and from the evils of our own actions. And whomsoever Allah guides, none can misguide. And whomsoever Allah leaves astray, none can guide back to the correct path. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Testify there is no deity worthy of worship except for Allah, who is alone in a partnership, and never has and never will be another. And we bear witness that Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, is the last and the final prophet of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our Sunday discussion. Continuing of the reading of When the Moon Split, biography of Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, by Safiur Rahman Mubarakpuri. Last week, we had finished the sections regarding the Battle of Uhud, and now we're getting into, as I was kind of mentioning, the Muslims licking their wounds and the actions and the rekindling of the forces after this time, inshallah. So it may not be as exciting as the last week's reading, inshallah, but it also touched bases on some really important parts of how the Muslims, rekindled their forces and became eventually powerful again, influential again after such a drastic defeat. So dialogue and resolution. So both sides were in a mode of retreat when the pagans were poised to return to Mecca. Abu Sufyan appeared on Mount Uhud and shouted, "Is Muhammad among you?" And nobody responded from the Muslim side. Abu Sufyan then shouted, "Is Abu Bakr, the son of Abu Quhafa, among you?" And once more he was met with silence. He shouted a third time, "Is Omar bin Khattab among you?" And this call also went unanswered because the Prophet ﷺ had forbidden the Muslims to make any reply. And the silence satisfied Abu Sufyan, who called out jubilantly, "We have finally been relieved of those three." And hearing these words, Omar impiously roared, "O enemy of Allah, all whom you name are alive, and Allah Almighty has more disgrace in store for you." And Abu Sufyan said, "Your slain have been mutilated. I neither ordered nor disliked it." And after that, he cried, "Glory to Hubal." And the Prophet ﷺ instructed his companions to counter, "Allah is the highest and most majestic." Abu Sufyan then shouted, "We have Uzza while you have none." And the Prophet ﷺ bade his followers to answer, "Allah is our Lord, but you have none." And Abu Sufyan reminded the Muslims of their loss, saying, "What a glorious deed we have wrought. This is our revenge for Badr. Victory in war goes by turns. One wins today and the other tomorrow." And Omar retorted, "The scores are certainly not even, for our dead have gone to paradise and yours to hell." And taken aback at Omar's conviction, Abu Sufyan conceded, "You people consider it so, and if it is true, we are losers." Then Abu Sufyan called Omar closer and said, "Omar, I ask you in the name of Allah if we have killed Muhammad." Omar swore, "By Allah, this is not true, and he is listening to what you say." And Abu Sufyan was convinced about the truth of Omar's words and complimented his enemy. "To me, you are more truthful and upright than Ibn Kama." And with his parting words, he issued a challenge. "We shall meet again at Badr next year." And at this, the Prophet ﷺ had a companion affirm, "Yes, it is an appointment between us." So the Muslims then tend to their own. So after this exchange, Abu Sufyan went back and the pagan troops began leaving the area. They rode their camels and kept their horses by their side to indicate the end of the battle and that they were headed for Mecca. And their inexplicable decision to head back was nothing but a sign of Allah's grace upon the Muslims, for nothing stood between the pagans and Medina. And had they pressed on, they would have found no opposition to the defenseless city, and the course of history would have been entirely different. But after the departure of the enemy, the Muslims came to the battlefield to take care of the wounded and the martyred. Some of the dead were transported to Medina, but the Prophet ﷺ ordained that the martyrs be brought back to the site of their deaths and that they be buried in battle dress without a bath in funeral prayer. He also buried 2 or 3 martyrs in a single grave, and in some cases, he directed his companions to shroud the martyrs in pairs. And the martyr who had learned more of the Quran was lowered in the grave first and paying tribute to their sacrifice in the cause of Allah. The Prophet ﷺ said, I shall be a witness unto them on the day of resurrection. And as they retrieved the bodies of their martyred brothers, the people came upon the body of Handala bin Abu Amir above the earth, with water dripping from it. And the Prophet ﷺ explained to his men that the angels are bathing him. And apparently, the newly married Handala had just consummated his marriage when the call for jihad was made. Without even stopping to bathe, he left his bride and rushed into the battlefield. And Handala fought heroically and was martyred. So the Prophet ﷺ explained that the angels were bathing him to purify his body. And Handala was forever remembered as Ghasil al-Malika, the one bathed by the angels. SubhanAllah. And it was a time to bury Hamza as well. The dead hero had earned Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's pleasure, and that was more rewarding than the ostentation of a grand burial. In fact, he was shrouded in a sheet so small that when his head was covered, his feet were bared, and when his feet were covered, his head was exposed, and some rushes were then put over his feet. So back to Medina. So the martyrs had been buried. And for anybody, just a quick mention, this is one of the famous sites, or it's still there today, if you ever visit the battle site of Uhud, where it's blocked off, chained off from anybody visiting, of course, but they still have the burial sites there today. Alhamdulillah. But the martyrs had been buried, and Allah SWT's blessing invoked upon them, and now it was time for the Prophet ﷺ to return to Medina. And on the way, he stopped to give solace to some women whose relatives had fallen in the field. His invocation to Allah SWT's blessing, of Allah SWT's blessing upon them, comfort them immensely. And many of the bereaved Muslims bore their losses with patience and took comfort in knowing that their Prophet ﷺ was safe, and although they had lost their own loved ones in the bargain. The following incident illustrates the priority the Muslims placed on the Prophet ﷺ's safety. A group of Muslims returning from the battle encountered a woman from the tribe of Banu Dinar, and her husband, brother, and father had all been killed at Uhud. And when she was told of each of their deaths, she responded each time, first tell me about the Prophet. And people replied, thanks to Allah, he is safe. But the woman was not satisfied with the men's assurances and asked to see for herself how the Prophet ﷺ was. And when the people brought her to him, she said simply, now that you are safe, every grief has vanished. So back in Medina, the Muslims spent the night on high alert, and after all, they were still in a state of emergency, exhausted and wounded. They were also overcome by deep sorrow and remorse for the actions of a few who had risked the life of the Prophet ﷺ himself, and they all insisted on guarding the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet ﷺ, on the other hand, felt that it was far more important to monitor the retreating enemy's movements carefully. He wanted to be prepared in case of a surprise attack on Medina. So there was an expedition of Hamra al-Asad. The very next morning, the Prophet ﷺ sent a crier to announce that all those who had fought in the battle of Uhud should prepare to pursue the enemy, and every Muslim who had fought at Uhud the day before followed. And the Prophet ﷺ out of Medina, regardless of the fatigue and the injury. Thus, they set out from Medina and camped at Hamra al-Asad, 8 miles away, and the pagans were camped at Rawha, 36 miles from Medina, holding a war council, and much recrimination was traded as troops berated their leaders. Why had they squandered the advantage by not entering Medina? At the moment, the Muslim camps were also pondering strategy. Ma'bad bin Abi Sa'id Ghazai, who was a well-wisher of the Prophet came to him at Hamra al-Asad and commiserated about the events at Uhud, and the Prophet ﷺ asked him to approach Abu Sufyan and use scare tactics to head the pagans off. And Mabad accordingly reached Roha, where the mood was in favor of returning to attack Medina. And Mabad dismayed the pagans with his description of the ferocity of the Muslims and their extensive preparations for a new encounter. Muhammad has come out with a horror like of which I have never seen. They are intent on revenge, and their mood is terrifyingly bloodthirsty. I think you will soon spot their vanguard appearing from behind this hill. And this ruse worked. The Meccan troops lost their bravado, and Abu Sufyan confined his response to a similar scare campaign. He decided to use some saber rattling of his own. He instructed a caravan to scare the Muslims by saying that the Meccans were ready for another round. Meanwhile, Abu Sufyan and his soldiers hurried back to Mecca. And having come so close to defeat, the subdued Muslims who heard this warning were prepared to fight on. The threat of a renewed battle only stifled their resolve, and they responded by quoting the following verse, Surah Ali Imran, Surah 3, Ayat 173. In the English translation, Allah SWT mentions, the hypocrites said, verily, the pagans have gathered against you, so fear them. But this increased the Muslims in faith, and they replied, Allah is sufficient for us, and He is the best to determine our affairs. And there was no further volley of threats, and the resulting calm is best described in the following verse, Surah Ali Imran, Surah 3, Ayat 174, in English translation, Allah SWT mentions, thus they returned with the blessing in the favor of Allah. No evil touched them, and they sought nothing but Allah's pleasure, and Allah is munificent beyond measure. So beyond that, the incidents and expeditions. So the Battle of Uhud had proved the Muslims' vulnerability. The pagans smelled blood and did not miss a single chance to gore their wounded enemy. In subsequent events, the Muslims experienced several painful losses, some of which are outlined as follows below. So first being the incident of Raja'i. In Safar, fourth year after the Hijrah, a delegation of the Adal and Qara tribes came to the Prophet ﷺ. They had mentioned a surge of interest in Islam amongst their people and wanted to know more about the faith. And the Prophet ﷺ sent 10 of his companions, headed by Asim bin Thabit, and the Muslims who had set out to teach the tribes the basic tenets of the faith and the Quran, learned a bitter lesson about the treachery of the polytheists. At Raj'i, the Adal and Qara set a branch of the Hudayl tribe upon the Muslims, and nearly 100 of their archers besieged the 10 Muslims on a hill, and they assured the Muslims on earth that they would not kill them. But Asim refused to descend, preferring instead to take on the enemy, as 7 of the Muslims were killed in this encounter. And again, the attackers pledged they want to kill the 3 remaining Muslims, who then surrendered and descended the hill. And as they were being bound, one of the 3 commented, "This is the first act of treachery." He then resisted his captors' attempts to tie him and was killed. And the remaining 2, Hubayb bin Adi and Zayd bin Lavina, were carried to Mecca and sold as slaves to their old tormentors, the Quraysh, and their lives were now no longer their own. And Hubayb had killed Harith bin Amr bin Nawfal in the Battle of Badr, and now Harith's son laid claim to Hubayb's life, and Hubayb suffered in prison for some time, and then he was carried to Tanim to be slain. And before his execution, he prayed 2 rakats, and he prayed for Allah SWT wrath to overtake his killers, and as he faced his death, he recited 2 couplets. I care not if I'm slain a Muslim, and I care not which side of mine is brutalized. This is for Allah, and if He so wills, He will bless the flesh of every joint. And Abu Sufyan asked Hubayb, don't you wish Muhammad were in your place and we had killed him while you were safe with your family? And Hubayb countered, by Allah, I would not wish to be with my family if in return Muhammad were even pricked by a thorn. And Hubayb was dead, and now Zayd bin the Athena awaited death at the hands of Safwan bin Umayyah, and Safwan was given the right to slay Zayd in retribution for the death of his father, Umayyah bin Maharath, at Badr. And some of the Muslim sources have attributed that the above quoted verbal encounter was between Abu Sufyan and Hubayb to Zayd bin Davina. So the dead Muslims on the mountain of Raji were also regarded as trophies by the Quraysh, who sent their men to retrieve Asim's body, but they drew back because of the swarm of hornets buzzing over the body. And in this way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected Asim's body from desecration at the hands of the polytheist. And Asim had sworn never to touch a polytheist, nor be touched by one, and his Lord has upheld this vow. SubhanAllah. So next is the tragedy of Ma'una. And about the same period, the Muslims suffered another setback, even more tragic than that of Raji. Abu Bara Amir bin Malik, who is known as Mal'ab al-Insa, the one who plays with lances, sought an audience with the Prophet ﷺ, who then invited him to Islam. And Abu Bara neither accepted nor rejected the Prophet ﷺ's counsel. He chose instead to volunteer his own opinion about the inclination of the people of Najd towards Islam. And he suggested that if the Prophet ﷺ sent some of his companions to Najd, the people there would enter Islam. And he also assured the Prophet ﷺ that the Muslims would be under his protection. So the Prophet ﷺ sent off a contingent of 70 Muslims who were well versed in the Quran. They camped at Bir Ma'una and Haram bin Malhan and went to Amir bin Tufail, a bitter enemy of Allah, with a letter from the Prophet ﷺ. And Amir's response was not to read the letter himself, but to order his servant to do so. And he took Haram unawares and pierced the latter body with his lance. And with his last breath, Haram cited, Allahu Akbar, by the Lord of the Kaaba, I have succeeded in my mission. And Amir then called out to the tribe of Banu Amir and to attack the rest of the Muslims, but they refused to break the pledge of protection made by Abu Bara. And Amir then called upon Banu Sulaim and some of his sub-tribes, such as Ral, Dhakwan, Lahyan, and Usayya, who readily came to besiege the companions and put all of them to death, save Ka'ab bin Zayd and Amr bin Umayyah. So Ka'ab bin Zayd were wounded and left for dead, and later he was rescued from the scene of the carnage, and he recovered only to be martyred in the Battle of the Trench, which will be the next major battle that comes up then. And Amr bin Umayyah, Damri, had been grazing his camels along with Mundir bin Uqba when he saw the vultures hovering at Bir Mauna, and instantly he guessed the outcome of the Muslims' visit to Amir bin Tufail, and Mundir rushed to the spot to rescue his brother Muslim, and he took to the enemy and fought until he was overcome. And as for Amr bin Umayyah, he was taken captive, but proved to be more fortunate than the rest of his Muslim brothers. When Amir bin Tufail was told that the prisoner belonged to the Mudir tribe, he simply took off a lock of Amr's hair as a trophy and freed him in fulfillment of a vow made by his mother. Thus it was that Amr bin Umayyah escaped death, and he immediately headed back towards Medina. And on the way, he came across two men from Banu Kilab from At Korkara, and taking them to be enemies, Amr killed the both of them, although they had with them a covenant of peace from the Prophet ﷺ. Back at last in Medina, he informed the Prophet ﷺ what he had done, and the Prophet's only words were, "You have killed two such men whose blood I must redeem." And both the incidents of Bir Mauna and Raji deeply anguished the Prophet ﷺ. He had sent two missions of peace, and both had ended tragically in the same month. And it was said that he received the news of both the tragedies the same night. And he found solace in prayer, qunut, supplicating for the martyred Muslims and calling down Allah's punishment on their killers. And for 30 days each morning after Fajr, the Prophet ﷺ prayed against the murderers until at last he received a revelation. And Allah SWT informed him that he had indeed met his martyred slaves, and he was pleased with them, and they had been no less pleased with their Lord's treatment of them. I kind of wish we would have seen the part of the Quran for that, but alhamdulillah. So next, the third mentioning here is the expedition against Banu Nadir. So other matters demanded the Prophet ﷺ's attention as well. Amr bin Umayyah's killing of the first two men from Banu Kilab had to be redressed. If no blood money was forthcoming, the Muslims would be deemed guilty for violating a pact, and more bloodshed could be expected. And consequently, the Prophet ﷺ went to Banu Nadir along with a few of his companions to ask them to contribute towards the blood money. And they said to him, Abdul Qasim, we shall do accordingly. Take your seat here. We will fulfill your need. And the Prophet ﷺ waited while the Jews consulted privately with one another. And unfortunately, Shaitan prevailed over their honor, and they decided to murder the Prophet ﷺ. They said to each other, who will carry this millstone and drop it on him? And up rose Amr bin Shash to carry out the deed. And in the meantime, as the Prophet ﷺ sat waiting for his host to come back with their decision, Jibril descended and revealed the plot to him. And the Prophet ﷺ hurried away and set out for the road to Medina, where he was joined by his companions. So treachery by allies who are bound by a treaty is never a light matter. By plotting against the Prophet ﷺ, Banu Nadir had demonstrated they could not coexist with the Muslims, and naturally the Prophet ﷺ wished to end the allegiance or the alliance, and based on the actions of the Jews, assumed that they were at war with one another. He therefore sent Muhammad bin Maslimah to issue an ultimatum to the Jews, and since they have forfeited their right to live with the Muslims, they were to leave Medina within 10 days. And each Jew found after the lapse of the deadline would be put to death. And after receiving this notice, the Jews began preparing to leave. So at that point, Abdullah bin Ubay, the head of the hypocrites, sent them a message urging them to stay on, for he had 2,000 warriors ready to enter their fortress and defend them, and the hypocrites had more struck to undermine the Prophet ﷺ's position. Here, Surah Al-Hashr refers to the tenuous alliance and how it was patched together with lies. Surah 59, 59, ayat 11. Do you not observe the hypocrites tell their faithless friends from among the people of the book, if you are driven out, we will accompany you. We will never obey your enemies, and if you are attacked, we will defend you. But Allah is witness that they are liars. So the Jews felt emboldened at such shows of support from their purported friends. They sent a message to the Prophet ﷺ that they were not about to leave Medina regardless of the consequences. And the Prophet ﷺ responded with Allahu Akbar. And his companions echoed the cry. This was a call to arms and entrusting the safety of Medina to Ibn Maktoum and the Muslim standard to Ali. The Prophet ﷺ and his troops advanced towards the territory of Banu Nadir and laid siege to them. And the Jews took refuge in their fortresses and castles and showered arrows and stones at the Muslim armies. And since the date groves and gardens stood as buffer zones, the Prophet ﷺ ordered men to cut down the trees and set the gardens ablaze. And this act sank the spirits of Banu Nadir. And after 6 days of holding out, some say a fortnight, 14 nights, they agreed to lay down arms on condition that they would be allowed to go to safety in exile. And their friends among Banu Qurayza had failed to support them, and as had the heads of the hypocrites and its allies. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in Surah 59, ayat 16, in an English translation, their allies deceive them the way Satan does when he says to man, disbelieve in Allah. When the man listens to him and commits disbelief, Satan suddenly says, I'm not responsible for your decision. I fear Allah and the Lord of the universe. And the Prophet ﷺ allowed the Jews to take their belongings, except their arms, and they carried with them whatever they could, even the doors, windows, and beams of the houses. In the Quran refers to this event in the following verse, Surah 59, ayat 2. Allah drove out the faithless tribe of Jews from their homes at the first gathering. You do not think that they would leave and thought their fortresses would protect them from Allah, but Allah approached them in a way they did not expect and cast terror into their hearts, and their homes were destroyed by their own hands as well as by the believers. Reflect on this event, those of you who have eyes. So thus, the Jews left Medina, most of them settling in Khaybar, while the small group migrated to Syria, and the land confiscated from the Jews was divided amongst the first Meccan immigrants, while Abu Lajuna and Sahal bin Hanif, two members of the Ansar, were given plots because of their financial situation. And the Prophet ﷺ used part of the revenue from the land to maintain his wives for the whole year, and the rest he spent on defense and for providing horses and arms for the Muslim warriors. 50 coats of mail, 50 helmets and 300 swords that had been seized were also distributed amongst the Muslim troops. So next, an appointment at Badr. Abu Sufyan had left Uhud with the promise of another military encounter the following year, and with the arrival of Shaban, fourth year after the Hijrah, the Prophet ﷺ preempted his adversary in a march towards the battlefield, and he camped at Badr, where he waited 8 days for Abu Sufyan. And he had with him a force consisting of 1,500 soldiers and 10 horses. Ali bin Abu Talib was the standard bearer, while the administration of Medina was handed over to Abdullah bin Rawaha. And Abu Sufyan was also set out with an army of 2,000 soldiers, including 50 cavalrymen. But from the start, he appeared to be lacking fire. For upon arriving at the venue, he remarked to his men, "Battle is suitable when there is freshness and greenery throughout, so that the animals can graze and we can also drink milk. But now, as there is drought everywhere, I'm going back, and you people should follow me." So Abu Sufyan's entire army seemed to share his sentiments and tamely marched back without meeting the enemy. The Muslims, meanwhile, stayed on in Badr and carried out a number of business transactions. They sold their goods and made handsome profits, and the Quraysh have retreated without drawing a single sword. So the Muslims returned with their military reputation in high standing. And in Rabi al-Awwal, the same year, the Prophet ﷺ launched a punitive attack on a group of bandits at Dumat al-Jundal, and at last all the enemies were subdued, and there was peace for an entire year, and a year that the Prophet ﷺ was able to spend consolidating the faith and teaching his followers. So with that, we will we'll stop here at the Battle of the Trench, inshallah, and get into that major event next week, inshallah, at page 183. So with that, we'll go ahead and close. Just like everybody for joining us, and we hope to see you on the following week. Allahumma subhanaka wa bihamdi, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.